It begins with a lunch invitation. A warm, familiar gathering on a quiet winter afternoon in Leongatha, a small town that rarely makes headlines. The table is set. The aroma of beef Wellington drifts through the kitchen. The guests arrive, Don and Gail Patterson, Gail's sister Heather Wilkinson, and Heather's husband Ian. Their family, bound by years of shared history, church connections, and enduring ties of small-town life. There's laughter as coats are hung and chairs are pulled out. Erin Patterson, the host, moves between the kitchen and the dining room, carrying plates, pouring wine, smiling as if everything is ordinary. But nothing about this day will end as it began. By the time the afternoon shadows lengthen, 3 of the guests will be dying. 1 will be fighting for his life. And Erin, the woman who served them lunch, will be at the center of a murder investigation that will grip the nation and divide it. To those who knew her, Erin wasn't a stranger to the Pattersons. She was family, once married to their son, Simon. There had been ups and downs, separations, reconciliations, and finally, the quiet drift into a complicated post-marriage relationship. Still, she had maintained connections with her former in-laws. A Sunday lunch didn't seem out of place. Not until the symptoms began. It started with discomfort, nausea, dizziness. Then it escalated violently into organ-shutting agony. Within hours, all 4 lunch guests were in the hospital. Death cap mushroom poisoning is one of the most lethal toxic exposures known in the culinary world. It attacks the liver, often with no cure beyond transplant. And even then, survival is not guaranteed. Don Patterson died first, then Gail, then Heather. Ian remained in a coma, clinging to life for weeks before slowly, miraculously, emerging. From the moment toxicology confirmed the presence of death cap toxins, police treated the case as suspicious. Accidental poisonings happen, but in most cases, it's the cook who suffers first. Here, Erin was untouched. That detail, whispered in hospital corridors and police briefings, would become the fulcrum of suspicion. Erin told detectives she had purchased dried mushrooms from an Asian grocery store in Melbourne, along with button mushrooms from a supermarket. She said she had no idea they were dangerous. She said she had eaten some of the beef Wellington herself, but not the portion served to her guests because she had scraped off the mushrooms as she disliked their texture. It was, to her, a tragic coincidence. To investigators, it was a glaring red flag. What happened in that kitchen became the heart of a criminal trial unlike anything Australia had seen in years. And as the weeks turned into months, the question shifted from what killed the Pattersons to was it murder or was it the most extraordinary accident imaginable? Leongatha is not the kind of place where people expect to see homicide detectives. It's the kind of town where doors are left unlocked, where everyone knows the name of the butcher, where Sunday lunches are as much a part of the rhythm of life as church bells and winter footy games. But in the weeks after July 29th, 2023, unmarked cars began appearing on quiet streets. Detectives from a homicide squad walked the main street, speaking to shop owners, retracing Erin Patterson's steps. In those early days, whispers traveled faster than facts. Some neighbors said they had seen Erin looking completely normal after the lunch, too normal for someone who had just fed her family a fatal meal. Others remembered her as quiet, maybe a little withdrawn in the weeks before. Everyone had a theory. Few had answers. Police interviewed Erin repeatedly. Each time, her story remained the same. She had bought 2 types of mushrooms, buttoned and dried, mixed them into a sauce, cooked the beef Wellington, and served it without any idea that anything was wrong. She explained that she had given her children different food that day, as they were picky eaters, and had later thrown away the leftover mushroom sauce. She admitted she had scraped off her own serving because she didn't like the texture. She denied flatly that she had any reason to harm her in-laws. Yet, the more police looked, the more inconsistencies they claimed to find. Why throw away leftovers so quickly? Why not eat the mushrooms if they were part of the dish? And why? If she truly believed the meal was safe, did she avoid serving to her children? The suspicion grew, fed by a single undeniable fact. Death cap mushrooms are not something you accidentally buy in a supermarket. They're usually foraged, often by mistake, sometimes misidentified as harmless varieties. If Erin's account was true, Then somewhere in Melbourne's food supply chain, a fatal mistake had been made. But police could not find that link. No other poisonings had been reported. No contaminated batch had been traced. The trail stopped at Erin's kitchen. It was then that investigators learned about her history with the Patterson family. Her marriage to Simon had been turbulent. There were separations, disputes, and lingering tensions. Erin had been open about feeling hurt by how her in-laws treated her after the split. Prosecutors would later argue that this was a woman with motive, a motive served, quite literally, on a plate. But those who knew her best said otherwise. Friends described her as kind, soft-spoken, not the type to hurt anyone. Some even wondered aloud if she was simply unlucky, caught in a nightmare chain of events she neither intended nor understood. From the very start, this case was going to be about more than mushrooms. It was about what people believe when the evidence is thin, when tragedy overlaps with suspicion, and when the story feels too strange to be coincidence. The autopsies were clinical, detached, and devastating. All three victims, Don Patterson, 70, his wife Gail, 70, and Gail's sister Heather Wilkinson, 66, had died from acute liver failure caused by amatoxin poisoning, the lethal chemical found in death cap mushrooms. The pathologist noted that the toxin worked with chilling efficiency. Within hours of ingestion, it began to destroy liver cells. Within days, organ failure followed. Ian Wilkinson, Heather's husband, was the exception, but only barely. He had spent weeks in the hospital, much of it in a coma, his survival dependent on around-the-clock care of medical staff. He later described his recovery as nothing short of a miracle. But even as his body began to heal, detectives were asking him questions from his hospital bed, piecing together his memory of the lunch. The toxicology reports were damning in their clarity. The level of amatoxin detected was not consistent with a mild accident. It was a fatal dose, the kind that leaves almost no chance of survival without a liver transplant. Investigators knew that such a dose could only come from a deliberate use of the mushroom in significant quantity, or from extraordinary, almost implausible accident. And yet, there was no smoking gun, no video of Erin collecting wild mushrooms, no witness who saw her preparing the beef Wellington with suspicious intent. What police had instead was a mosaic of circumstantial evidence, small inconsistencies in her statements, the disposal of leftovers, the fact that she did not consume the same portion as her guests. In one interview, she admitted she had preserved some leftover beef for her estranged husband, Simon, to take home. But that meat never reached him. Instead, she later claimed she threw away after it had spoiled in the fridge. To prosecutors, that was more than suspicious. It was an act of evidence destruction. Then came the twist that gave the case its most chilling turn. The police confirmed they had found a food dehydrator in a landfill, traced back to Erin. In an early interview, Erin reportedly said she had thrown it out in a panic after the deaths. She later explained it had been used to dry other foods, not mushrooms. But by then, the narrative was cementing. This was not an ordinary Sunday lunch gone wrong. As news of the investigation spread, the public became divided. Some saw Erin as a cold, calculating killer who had used an exotic method to ensure her victims' deaths. Others saw her as a woman trapped in a web of suspicion, her every action reinterpreted through a lens of guilt. The case was no longer just a local tragedy. It was a national obsession. On television panels, experts in toxicology debated the rarity of accidental death cap poisonings. Criminal psychologists weighed in on whether someone could commit such an act and maintain composure. And in online forums, strangers argue about whether Erin was a manipulative killer or the unluckiest cook in Australia. Every day, the pressure built for Erin, for investigators, for a community that had never seen anything like it. On an overcast morning in November 2023, Erin Patterson's quiet suburban street in Leongatha transformed into the stage for a national spectacle. Neighbors awoke to the sight of police vehicles lining the road, uniformed officers moving with deliberate, unmistakable purpose. Detectives have been building their case for months, and now they believe they had enough to bring her in. Erin was arrested on suspicion of multiple counts of murder and attempted murder. Cameras captured her being led away, her face unreadable, her voice low as she told a reporter, "I didn't do anything wrong." But by that point, the story had already outrun her words. To much of the public, she was the center of the now infamous mushroom murders. When she appeared in court for the first time, the room was packed, journalists jostling for position, sketch artists capturing every flicker of expression, and members of the victims' families sitting rigidly in the gallery. The charges were read. 3 count of murder for Don Patterson, Gail Patterson, and Heather Wilkinson, and 1 count of attempted murder for Erin Wilkinson. Prosecutors began to sketch their version of events. Erin, they said, had deliberately prepared a meal laced with death cap mushrooms, serving her guests the toxic portions while ensuring her own plate was free from danger. They described the act as targeted and premeditated, and said the method, rare, deadly, and difficult to trace, was chosen for its effectiveness. In the opening arguments, the prosecution painted a picture of strained family dynamics. They spoke of Erin's divorce from Simon Patterson, of custody disputes, of grievances that had, in their view, fermented into something darker. They called the food dehydrator the silent witness, an appliance they claimed had been used to process the mushrooms before being discarded to destroy evidence. The defense's tone was radically different. Erin's lawyer stood in a measured voice, told the jury that this was a tragedy, not a crime. They argued that Erin had no motive to kill her in-laws, that the lunch had been intended as a gesture of goodwill, and that the mushrooms had been purchased dried from an Asian grocery store, not foraged in the wild. Any poisoning, they suggested, had been accidental, a nightmare no one could have foreseen. Throughout the trial, Erin remained largely composed. She would glance occasionally at the jury, but often kept her eyes down, jotting notes on a yellow legal pad. She pleaded not guilty to all charges. Then came the witness testimony. Friends of the victims described them as kind, loving, and trusting. The sort of people who would never suspect a family meal could be dangerous. Investigators testified about the toxicology results, the severity of the amatoxin levels, the timing of symptoms. A forensic expert explained that the amount of toxin detected could not have come from a stray mushroom fragment. It was the equivalent of several full caps. But the most haunting testimony came from Erin Wilkinson himself. Frail but determined, he told the court what he remembered from that day. The warmth of the gathering, the rich smell of the beef Wellington, the sudden wave of illness that overtook them all. "I remember thinking," he said quietly, "this is the sickest I've ever felt." And then nothing until the hospital. Each word seemed to tighten the room. The jurors listened in silence. Erin sat perfectly still. The prosecution ended its first week by showing photographs of the victims taken before the lunch, smiling, healthy, full of life. Then they displayed the grim contrast. Images from the hospital, the tubes, the monitors, the pale skin, the stillness. The emotional contrast was almost unbearable. The question hanging over it all was simple and devastating. Was this the work of a cold-blooded killer or the unthinkable result of a culinary accident? The second week of the trial began with cross-examinations that would test every fragile thread of Erin Patterson's defense. The prosecution's case had been methodical so far, but now it was the defense's turn to chip away at it. Erin's lawyer wasted no time challenging the police investigation, suggesting that critical evidence had been handled carelessly, that assumptions were made too early, and that bias against his client had tainted the process from the beginning. When the food dehydrator was brought up, the alleged tool used to prepare the deadly mushrooms, the defense pressed hard. They pointed out that there was no definitive forensic link between the dehydrator and the poisoned meal. Suspicion, the lawyer said, is not proof, and suspicion has filled the gaps in this investigation from day one. But the prosecution wasn't about to let the momentum shift. They called Erin herself to the stand, a moment the courtroom had been anticipating. She walked to the witness box slowly, her hands clasped, and sat down without looking at the gallery. Her voice, when she began, was steady but soft. She described the events of July 29th, 2023, in vivid detail. The preparation of the beef Wellington, the slicing of the mushrooms, the smell of the pastry baking. She insisted that the mushrooms had been bought dried from a local Asian grocery store, that she'd used them many times before without issue. She told the court she had eaten some of the dish herself, though admitted she had only consumed a small portion because she wasn't feeling well that day. When asked about the dehydrator, Erin hesitated. She admitted she had thrown it out after the lunch, but claimed it was for an unrelated reason. It was old, and I'd been meaning to get rid of it. I didn't think it was important. The prosecution pounced on the inconsistency. You disposed of an appliance that could have been key evidence in the middle of a homicide investigation, and you didn't think it was important? The question hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. Erin's expression flickered. A brief flash of discomfort quickly masked. She answered simply, "No, I didn't think it mattered." The cross-examination was relentless. The prosecutor read aloud fragments from interviews Erin had given to police, pointing out contradictions in her timeline. In one version, she claimed she hadn't eaten any of the dish at all. In another, she said she had. When asked about the precise source of the mushrooms, her description shifted subtly, details forgotten, locations blurred. At one point, the prosecutor leaned forward and asked directly, "Ms. Patterson, are you asking this jury to believe that 3 people died, 1 nearly died? It was all just a coincidence?" Erin paused. The courtroom was silent. Finally, she said, "I'm asking them to believe the truth. And the truth is, I didn't mean for any of this to happen." Some jurors leaned back in their chairs. Others glanced down at their notes. It was impossible to know what they were thinking. That day ended with more forensic testimony, an expert outlining exactly how amatoxins ravage the liver, how they work their way through the body, and how symptoms can take hours to appear, making early treatment nearly impossible. The expert concluded that the victims had ingested a concentrated lethal dose, and that accidental cross-contamination was highly improbable. By the time the court adjourned, the case felt balanced on a knife's edge. The defense had sown seeds of doubt, but the prosecution's narrative was still intact, sharpened even by the inconsistencies in Erin's account. The next day would bring something no one in that courtroom was prepared for, a piece of evidence that would shift the trial's energy in an instant. The morning of the 3rd week began without fanfare, the usual shuffling of papers and low murmur of voices filling the air, but there was a tension that seemed almost physical. The prosecution announced that they had a previously undisclosed exhibit to present. Whispers moved through the gallery like static. It was a handwritten note, recovered from Erin Patterson's home during a secondary search months after the initial investigation. The paper was creased, slightly smudged, and dated a week before the fatal lunch. It wasn't long, just a few lines, but the prosecution claimed its contents were damning. The jury leaned forward as the prosecutor read it aloud. "Lunch on Saturday. We'll make beef Wellington. Need to pick up mushrooms, the good kind." He paused, letting the words hang before continuing. "Don't forget, no leftovers." There was a ripple in the room, the kind that comes when a piece of information feels like more than it appears. Erin's lawyer objected immediately, arguing that the note was vague, innocuous, even potentially about something else entirely. But the damage was done. The phrase "no leftovers" clung to the room like a bad smell. When asked on the stand about the note, Erin seemed almost deflated. She explained that the good kind simply meant fresh, high-quality mushrooms for the dish, and that no leftovers was a reference to wanting the meal eaten fresh, not saved for later. "It's being twisted," she insisted, her voice almost a whisper. It wasn't about anything sinister, but the prosecution pressed harder. They reminded the court that Erin had allegedly served herself a smaller portion, and none of that portion had been retained for testing. They contrasted her explanations with testimony from Heather Wilkinson, the surviving victim, who, still gone from his months of recovery, told the court he remembered Erin making a passing comment about how rich the mushrooms tasted. Ian's appearance was one of the trial's most emotional moments. He spoke quietly, his voice shaking at times, describing the hours after the lunch when the first waves of nausea hit. "It wasn't just food poisoning," he said, pausing as if to find the right words. "It felt like my body was shutting down, one organ at a time. I thought, this is it." His eyes glistened when he recalled his wife's final hours in the hospital. Her hands cold, her breathing shallow, and the doctors unable to stop the toxin's progression. The defense handled Ian's testimony delicately, careful not to appear callous, but they did raise one question. How certain could he be, given a condition, about exactly what was said or done during the meal? Ian admitted that some moments were hazy, blurred by the illness. Still, his grief was palpable and the jury felt it. That afternoon, the court heard from a toxicology expert who had reviewed all available evidence. He confirmed that the mushrooms used in the beef Wellington were unmistakably the deadly death cap variety, and that such mushrooms have no safe culinary use. Even a small quantity, he said, can be fatal. For 3 people to have died from a single dish, the amount would have been substantial. The weight of his words settled like a stone in the courtroom. Erin kept her gaze fixed downward, her expression unreadable. By the time the day's proceedings ended, the sense in the room had shifted. This was no longer just a trial about whether a tragedy had been intentional or accidental. It was a trial about whether the jurors believed Erin's story at all. And with each piece of evidence, that belief seemed to hang by a thinner thread. The final week of the trial began with a heaviness that seemed to press on every person in the room. This was it, the end of the long march through grief, suspicion, and forensic detail. The prosecution rose first for their closing argument, and the lead prosecutor wasted no time reminding the jury of the stakes. 3 lives gone, 1 life forever changed. A method so rare and deliberate that it left no room for doubt, they claimed. He spoke with deliberate pacing, his voice low but commanding, weaving the timeline together one last time. She cooked it, she plated it, she served it, he said, looking directly at the jury, and she did not eat the same portion as the rest. That is not a coincidence. That is intent. He gestured toward the prosecution's table, where the photographs of the victims sat like silent witnesses. Don Patterson, Gail Patterson, Heather Wilkinson. They trusted her enough to sit at her table, and she gave them a death sentence disguised as lunch. The words hung heavy in the air. When it was the defense's turn, Erin's lawyer rose slowly, as if the weight of the case had settled on him too. He didn't thunder, didn't shout. Instead, he spoke with a quiet urgency, the kind that makes people lean in. He told the jury this was not a story of murder, but a terrible, almost unthinkable accident. He painted Erin as a woman already battered by life, whose marriage had ended, whose relationships with her former in-laws were strained but still intact enough for shared meals. She's guilty of being careless, perhaps, he said, guilty of not knowing the difference between a safe mushroom and a deadly one. But she is not guilty of murder. You don't invite people you want to kill into your home and serve them a meal at your own table, knowing you will be sitting right there beside them. He reminded the jury that no one had seen Erin physically separate her own food, that no one could prove beyond a reasonable doubt she had chosen the mushrooms knowing they were lethal. He asked them to remember the principle that has shaped every trial in that courtroom. The burden is not on Erin to prove her innocence, but on the prosecution to prove her guilt. As the defense sat down, the judge gave his instructions. His voice was steady, measured, but there was no mistaking the gravity. You must consider only the evidence presented, not speculation, not rumor. The verdict you return must be unanimous and based solely on the facts as you find them. Then came the waiting. The jury filed out just after noon. Hours passed. The air in the courtroom seemed to thicken with each tick of the clock. Erin sat at the defense table, hands clasped, occasionally glancing toward the door as if trying to will the jury back into the room. At one point she closed her eyes and didn't open them for several minutes, her breathing slow and controlled, like someone bracing for a wave they couldn't stop. It was early evening when the sound of bailiff's voice calling for order broke the quiet. The jury had reached a decision. People leaned forward in their seats, reporters poised with pens and cameras. The jurors filed back in, their expressions carefully neutral, but their eyes gave nothing away. The clerk stood, holding a folded piece of paper. Madam Foreperson, he asked, has the jury reached a verdict? The foreperson's voice was calm, almost attached. We have. The paper was handed to the clerk, then to the judge, who read it silently before passing it back. The room was so quiet you could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning. The clerk cleared his throat and began to read aloud. On the charge of murder of Don Patterson, guilty. A ripple moved through the gallery, the sound of quiet gasps and murmurs. Erin sat motionless, eyes fixed straight ahead. On the charge of murder of Gail Patterson, guilty. Her lawyer's jaw tightened, his gaze fixed on the table in front of him. On the charge of murder of Heather Wilkinson, guilty. A sob broke somewhere in the back of the room, sharp and raw. And on the charge of attempted murder of Erin Wilkinson, guilty. It was done. The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy and irreversible. The judge thanked the jury for their service, dismissing them from their duty, but no one moved right away. The room felt frozen in place, as though everyone needed a moment to process the finality of what they had just heard. Erin's face barely changed. No tears, no sudden outburst, no collapse. Just a stillness that made her impossible to read. Was it shock, resignation, or something else entirely? Her lawyer leaned toward her, speaking quietly, but she didn't look at him. Across the aisle, the families of the victims held each other. Some cried openly. Others just sat with their heads bowed, absorbing the moment they had waited for since that July afternoon in 2023. For them, justice had been a long and bitter road. When the judge pronounced a sentence, life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for each murder charge, to be served concurrently, it was as though the case's long shadow finally settled. Erin was led away, flanked by officers, her hands cuffed in front of her. She didn't look back. Outside, reporters swarmed the courthouse steps, their questions colliding in a chaotic wall of sound. Asterisk, do you still maintain your innocence? Asterisk, asterisk, why didn't you eat the beef Wellington? Asterisk, asterisk, do you regret inviting them over that day? Asterisk, but Erin didn't answer. She was placed in the back of a waiting van, its door closing with a dull metallic thud that seemed to echo in the humid evening air. And yet, even with the verdict delivered and the sentence imposed, the case refused to fade quietly. In homes across Australia, in online forums, in conversations over coffee, the same question persisted. Was this truly an act of cold-blooded murder, or was it, as Erin Patterson claimed, a tragic, almost unimaginable accident? In the weeks after the verdict, the town of Leongatha seemed quieter than usual. The Patterson and Wilkinson families, once fixtures in the community, had been shattered by loss. Friends and neighbors spoke softly about the trial, their words tinged with both relief and disbelief. Some said justice had been served. Others hesitated, their voices dropping when they admitted they weren't entirely sure. The national media, meanwhile, continued to feed the fire. Headlines framed Erin as the Black Widow of Leongatha, painting her as a woman who had methodically plotted her revenge. Talk shows replayed courtroom footage, zooming in on her impassive face during the reading of the verdict. Experts were brought in to explain just how deadly death cap mushrooms are, how a single cap can kill an adult, and how cooking does nothing to destroy the toxin. Viewers at home were reminded again and again of the stakes, how the line between life and death at that lunch had been drawn by something as small as a bite. But online, the story took on a life of its own. In Facebook groups and Reddit threads, strangers dissected every scrap of information. Why Erin had used a dehydrator, why she claimed she bought the mushrooms from an Asian grocery store, why she hadn't fallen ill herself. Some users insisted the case was open and shut. No one could accidentally serve a dish like that without knowing the risk. Others countered with arguments about poor investigative work, about how circumstantial evidence could be twisted to fit a narrative. Erin's own words, delivered during a rare police interview months before her arrest, were replayed endlessly. "I love them. I would never hurt them," she had said, her voice breaking slightly before regaining its composure. And yet, prosecutors had painted those words as calculated, part of an effort to mask her guilt. Which version of Erin Patterson was real? The grieving ex-daughter-in-law caught in a nightmare? Or the cold, deliberate killer described by the Crown? For Erin Wilkinson, the sole survivor, recovery was a long and grueling process. The months he had spent in hospital, much of it in a coma, had left him physically weakened. Publicly, he said little about Erin or the trial. Those close to him claimed he preferred to focus on healing, though others suspected that speaking about the events of that day was simply too painful. In the end, the case of the mushroom murders became more than a story of 3 deaths. It became a mirror held up to the public, reflecting our hunger for answers, our willingness to speculate, and our unease with ambiguity. Because even with a guilty verdict, Even with a life sentence handed down, some found themselves lying awake at night wondering if the truth had been fully uncovered or if it had been buried quietly beneath layers of fear, grief, and the irresistible pull of a tidy ending. In the final weeks before Erin Patterson was transferred to a women's correctional facility, the weight of the trial lingered like a low, unshakable fog. She spent most of her days in the small confines of her cell, visited only by her legal team and the occasional family member. Guards later recalled that she was polite, even soft-spoken, never raising her voice, never showing visible anger. And yet, in those same quiet moments, they wondered what might have been playing behind her eyes. Regret, resentment, or something else entirely. Outside the prison walls, the public's fascination didn't fade. True crime podcasts dissected every minute detail of the case. Documentary crews made inquiries about filming in Leongatha, their questions sometimes reopening wounds that the townspeople had tried to let heal. Restaurants began displaying signs declaring their mushroom safe or locally sourced, as though the shadow of the case had crept into every kitchen. The Patterson family home, once a place of warmth and Sunday dinners, now sat still and empty, its windows reflecting nothing but the overcast sky. And in that stillness, the absence of Dawn, Gail, and Heather was felt in ways words couldn't fully capture. Friends remembered Dawn's dry humor, Gail's careful way of listening, Heather's generous laugh. Those memories became almost sacred. The kind people guarded fiercely, unwilling to let them be overshadowed entirely by the manner of their deaths. For some, the verdict brought closure. For others, it left a hollow space where certainty was supposed to be. The Crown had argued a clear, deliberate plan. Erin's defense had maintained an accident. The jury had chosen one version. But truth isn't always bound by courtroom walls. Years from now, the mushroom murders will likely still be spoken of in whispers at family gatherings, in lectures on criminal law, in warning tales told to remind us that danger can arrive in the most ordinary forms. A home-cooked lunch, a familiar face at the head of the table, a slice of beef Wellington, golden and perfect on the outside, hiding something deadly within. And maybe that's what unsettles us the most. Not the idea that someone could plan such a thing, but the possibility, however small, that no plan existed at all. That 3 people died and 1 barely survived because of an accident so horrific and improbable that it defies belief. That the difference between innocence and guilt, between a tragic mistake and a calculated act, might be nothing more than the thickness of a single mushroom cap. We close this story not with answers, but with the echoes of questions that refuse to fade. Who was Erin Patterson on that July afternoon in 2023? A grieving woman caught in the cruelest twist of fate, or a killer who thought she could outwit the world? The truth, if there is such a thing in this case, may now belong only to her, and she is not telling.